Federal Fag and Alex Reynolds Mystery Series Book 2. Author Fred Hunter, publisher St. Martin's Press, New York, 1998. Narrator Eric Ost. For Raymond Dragon. Chapter 3. I returned to our room in a mood that was a mixture of anger and stupor. Peter was sitting on the balcony in a bathing suit, reading the latest Ellen Hart. I stepped up to the railing without a word and gazed out at the ocean, my back to him. He waited a few minutes before he said, "How'd it go?" "I used to love him," I said. I rested my elbows on the railing and propped my chin up on my folded hands. I added, I thought I did. It was a long time ago." Peter was surprised by this admission because neither of us is given to talking much about the past. Through a silent mutual consent, we have resolutely steered clear of discussing our past relationships. We're not burying our heads in the sand. We're both well aware that each of us had known other men in the biblical sense before we met. We just think it's best not to discuss old boyfriends in anything other than anecdotal terms, an arrangement that I find perfectly healthy. Peter said nothing, giving me space and time to proceed at my own pace. "I came out for him, you know," I said. "I don't understand." I glanced at him over my shoulder. "I came out for him in college. I wasn't exactly in the closet. I was just not active. And when I met Patrick, I came out with a vengeance because I thought I loved him." I sighed and felt as if 100 years of turmoil was shaking out of me with the action. He was the first guy I ever slept with. I went with him for, I think, about 6 months. I was head over heels, and I was sure he loved me too. "What happened?" I shrugged. "Same old story. Like the proverbial wife, I was the last to know he was sleeping with anybody and everybody, and when I found out, I realized that he didn't love me. He just loved sex. That part of him hasn't changed." I let out a rueful little laugh. "You see, I'm so damn middle class, I was looking for a husband like you." Peter rose and put his hands on my shoulder. "You were mature, sweetheart." The amazing thing is, he'd gotten by Mother, too. She met him and liked him. I never told her what happened. All she knew was that I'd stopped seeing him, not the reason why, and she never asked. "She wouldn't. She has too much sense," he said quietly. I smiled, but it faded quickly at the memory. "I've never told anybody because I was just too humiliated." Peter turned me around and put his arms around my neck, drawing my head down onto his shoulder. "The worst part is," I continued as I slid my arms around him, "that I never said anything to him either. I just never had anything to do with him anymore. I never told him what a shit he was." Peter was silent a moment, tightening his embrace, then he said, "Maybe that's why you needed to talk to him so badly. Maybe you needed to tell him that." If that was the case, I still did. Even though the emotional nature of the day had left me exhausted, I spent most of the night tossing and turning in bed. Peter lay there quietly, but I was certain that he was awake a good deal of the time. By morning, I had made a decision. Peter was right. It was time for me to confront Patrick, not about his current affairs, but about those of our past. Unlike the previous day, Peter offered to come with me and wait in the car, but I told him that if he'd thought his presence would have been inappropriate at yesterday's lunch, it would be even more so at today's confrontation, and his presence would have made it harder to do without falling apart. Though it was only about 9 in the morning, the sun already seemed high and hot to me as I climbed into our rental car and headed out for Patrick's apartment. The address Jimmy Bender had given me was on Palm Way, a street that proved easy enough to locate and that fully lived up to its name. It was lined on both sides with towering trees with drooping palms. There were brown fronds scattered here and there about the street like large dead animals. The sun was not yet at an angle where it would throw direct light onto the street, and that, coupled with the ominously overhanging trees, cast a sense of gloom over the area. I drove slowly up the street, scanning the building for the number where Patrick lived. There was a lot of abode and stucco in evidence, all painted in pastels. All the buildings seemed to have been erected decades ago and had not been touched since. The whole place had a ramshackled and forested feel. Maybe it was just my mood. I finally found Patrick's building in the middle of the third block. I parked the car, got out, and went directly to the front door, afraid that any hesitation would weaken my resolve. The general quiet was enough to set my nerves on edge. Though Palm Way was pretty close to a major thoroughfare, it was extremely quiet, the stillness only occasionally interrupted by the loud crack of palm fronds hitting the street. The building was a two-story square painted Pepto-Bismol pink. To the right of the glass doors was a large crack that ran up the side of the wall like a nasty black vine. The doors gave a full view of the enclosed courtyard, which was open to the sky and the elements. A sidewalk snaked around the perimeter of the square, and the first floor apartments opened and directly onto it. Instead of the sunniness you might have expected, it was overshadowed by the walkway that circled the second floor. The lock on the glass door was broken, and the amount of rust bearing evidence to the fact that it had been in that condition for quite some time. The door creaked noisily as I swung it open and slammed with the finality of a cell door behind me after I'd stepped through. I started around the walk looking for apartment number 5. Despite the openness of this courtyard, my footsteps echoed loudly. I was surprised by the general dinginess of the place, convinced as I was that Patrick was making money hand over fist, so to speak. Cracks ran like varicose veins up most of the walls, probably the result of earthquakes, but I was still at a loss for why nothing was done about them. The grass was brown, and the half-hearted attempt at a garden had been foiled by an early death. The air was foul with the smell of fetid earth. There was a rustling in a bush that spread under one apartment window, and I was sure I didn't want to know what had caused it. Each door was covered with cracking paint in a hue just off from the paint on the walls, and each bore a very old, tarnished mock brass number. I found number 5 in a corner beneath the stairway to the second floor. I knocked, but there was no answer. I waited, knocked again, and when there was still no answer, I called out, "Patrick, it's me. I want to talk to you." My voice seemed to bounce around the courtyard. I was rather puzzled because I didn't think he would leave his apartment so early, and that is probably why I tried the door before leaving. To my surprise, it wasn't locked, but swung open readily, banging against the inner wall. "Patrick, it's Alex. Are you here?" I was greeted with the kind of silence that rings in your ears. I stepped into the apartment, which was blindingly dark, given the general gloominess outside and the cheap, heavy curtains drawn across the one window. I immediately noticed how musty and dank the place smelled, as if decades of moisture had soaked deep into the core of the place and would never be fully extracted. It was a sickly smell that made me feel the way I do back home when using one of the underpasses along Lakeshore Drive to cross over to the lake. Like it's unhealthy even to breathe there. I called to Patrick again and received no answer. I continued carefully into the apartment, my eyes slowly adjusting to the lack of light. The surroundings were to be really generous, not palatial. To be less generous, the place was squalid. It consisted of one room and a sort of a closet that served as a kitchen. There was a filthy shag rug of indeterminate color which covered only half the room. The furnishings were early college dorm. There was an extremely old white naga-hide couch with several slash-like tears across its back, a card table with one chair, and a tiny ancient television set. This apartment was at odds with a successful old friend with whom I'd lunched the day before. Directly across from the room, from the front door, was the bathroom, the door of which was slightly ajar. I cringed at the thought of the condition the bathroom might be in, but couldn't help myself. I had to look. I pushed the door, and it swung open like a curtain going up on a play. There was Patrick. He was naked and lay sprawled in the empty bathtub. There was a bullet hole in his forehead and another in his chest. In the brief moment before I became paralyzed, I think I half believed that a trick was being played on me, like something out of Diabolique. But there was enough physical evidence to convince me otherwise. I froze, unable to move or take my eyes away from the corpse. It's because of the shock that I didn't become aware of the sound until it was almost upon me, though I realized then that I had heard of somewhere in the back of my mind, there were footsteps echoing through the courtyard. I hadn't shut the door when I came in, and the contents of the bathroom were plainly visible from the front door. I was still frozen when the footsteps reached the door and stopped, but I was jarred from that state when a female voice said in an ancient whisper, "Is he dead?" I turned and looked at the woman blankly. She was silhouetted in the doorway like an apparition. She was wearing a huge floppy sun hat that had a sheer material over the top and tied around her chin. She also wore some sort of flowing peasant dress type thing that made her seem swathed in cloth rather than dressed in a particular way and served to hide her shape. I thought I must have just happened into a nightmare. The woman remained motionless, like a phantom that had appeared to herald the death, but at the same time she seemed to pulsate with anxiety that somehow seemed to have more to do with discovering me than with the dead body. Though I could see nothing of her face, there was something inexplicably familiar about her. I was so startled I couldn't seem to speak or move. After a very tense silence, the woman said, "We've got to get out of here." And that's when I recognized her. It was my mother. A Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold: to offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides, and in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.